Supporters of so-called gender-affirming care often proclaim that this approach is the approach. It can reduce emotional distress. It can improve a sense of well-being. It will reduce the risk of suicide in trans-identifying people. But is any of that true? A new documentary, Affirmation Generation, The Lies of Transgender Medicine, takes on these claims and turns them upside down with real stories from real people who have been failed by gender-affirming care. Joining us now to discuss are executive producer Joey Brite, detransitioner Cat Cattinson, and therapist Stephanie Winn, who are all featured in the documentary. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Megyn. Great to be here.
So Joey, let me start with you. You are the EP of this documentary and somebody who was pulled in this into this world of affirming care yourself eventually. What made you want to do this film?
Because I knew that if I were 8 years old today and living in California, and I was a very rambunctious tomboy, I also know I was very attracted to other girls. And if I were in elementary school today and said anything about feeling like a boy, or I wanted somebody to call me Mike or whatever at school, and they started doing it, and I told my parents and they said, no way. I know that I could complain to the school. And now in California, as of just a couple weeks ago, there's a new bill that passed. I could contact CPS, or the school could contact CPS, and I would end up in the foster care system.
Child Protective Services. You had a very different experience because you're not, you weren't born in 1996.
Right.
You went to a
1955.
therapist. Right. So you went to a therapist who you credit with saving your life because things used to look very different. Tell us what your therapist said to you.
Yeah, I was really hoping that I could somehow, I knew that it was going to take some sort of a medical process of some way. And I'd heard about testosterone. And I deliberately found a lesbian therapist who I knew herself was gender nonconforming. And I went to the first session and I told her that I knew that I was really a man and I needed her help. And she looked at me and she had sort of a smirk on her face. And she said, "You're not a man. You're never going to be a man. You're a lovely butch woman. And I want to help you to learn to love yourself. I hope that I can help you on that journe."
I love that. I love that. You're a lovely butch woman. I've been saying for so long, our tent is very big. The women tent is very big. You can have the long blonde hair with the pretty pink sweater, or you can have the short hair with the black glasses. It doesn't make you a man if you look more butch, right? Or if you happen to want to get it on with women.
And we were targeted.
What do you mean?
We were targeted with street grade testosterone by some kind of salesperson that I regretted later that I didn't ask him for a business card, but instead I told him to get the hell out of here when he approached a group of us outside of a pop-up lesbian bar back in the 90s, and he had a little blue plastic vial with pills. And after I told him to get the hell out of here, and he did, I yelled to him, "What's in there?" And he said, "Testosterone. I got what you want. I got what you need." That's exactly what he said to us.
That's scary. And as you point out, if you had been in today's medical care system, you could have a disfigured forearm right now because they cut it up to make a fake phallus. You could have been the victim of top surgery you didn't want or need. You could have been stuffed full of hormones that you didn't want or need that are genuinely life-changing and potentially damaging and could render you infertile. I mean, that's, I assume, why you wanted to make the film.
Yes, that and many reasons. I mean, when I was first being an advocate for women's rights and child safeguarding, the child safeguarding really pumped up because I had never thought that they were going to go after kids. I thought they were just experimenting with lesbians, that was a hated, targeted area. And along comes the internet and a lot more time. And then along comes all of this grooming. And I just put all the stuff together, and it just made me more and more to the point where in 2021, I helped to orchestrate over 13 protests against pediatric gender clinics. And no big, I contacted everybody to come and film us. And it wasn't until the very last protest that we had at Los Angeles Children's Hospital in October of 2021 that Fox News showed up. And I had been talking to the producer. They shot a lot of footage, but they're the only ones in terms of mainstream media.
Good for them. Honestly, it's moments like, of course, I worked at Fox for 17 years, but it's moments like that I want people to remember as Fox is getting dragged in the news for the lawsuit and the Dominion, and that'll all play out in a court of law the way it should, I'm sure. But that's why Fox News is so important, because they will tell the stories like this one that the rest of the media will ignore for ideological reasons. Before I bring in our other two guests, I want to show the audience a little clip from Affirmation Generation. I want to tell them as well that it is available at affirmationgenerationmovie.com, affirmationgenerationmovie.com. Here's a bit of a clip on the comorbidities that detransitioners featured in the film suffer from.
I knew there was something more than just depression and anxiety and autism. I felt like there was something else. And initially I thought that something else was filled by gender dysphoria.
I think that being sexually assaulted absolutely contributed to my gender dysphoria getting stronger and wanting to be a woman even less.
I was diagnosed with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, traits of borderline personality disorder, traits of post-traumatic stress from childhood bullying.
I had suffered from an eating disorder. I had had a suicide attempt.
From the time I was 11 or 12, I developed anorexia nervosa. And then years later, it led me to develop body dysmorphia, which I falsely, wrongly attributed to being gender dysphoria.
And it's one thing, right? Cat, you're featured in that montage saying that you had a sexual assault in your history, that you had an eating disorder. It is one thing for you to go through those traumas and then get confused about what the source of your anxiety is. You know, is it gender? Is that going to make me feel better? It is quite another for all the professionals around you to uniformly be pushing you to, quote, change your gender, transition your gender. So tell us how your journey sort of evolved from your anxieties to, yes, you're in the wrong body.
Yeah, so I want to contrast my experience with Joey's a little bit, because I was a person born closer to 1996, not in 1996, but definitely a different era in terms of how the medical field responds to gender dysphoria. And I was even in the early wave of transitioners and detransitioners. I started identifying as trans when I was 13 after finding an online, a website and forum for FTM people, which is, in the trans community, that's female to male transgender people. So women who take testosterone, get double mastectomies, et cetera. And, I also had trauma from being bullied, and I had a lot of mental health conditions. I had started to develop an eating disorder, and I started to attribute all of my other problems to, well, it's just because I'm born in the wrong body. And it just, it felt like an easier fix somehow than like actually confronting my issues. I don't think I was capable of it at that point. And the first gender therapist I saw was when I was 17 years old. And, rather than like Joey's therapist who tried to help her accept herself as she was, my therapist affirmed me within the first 2 appointments and started calling me he, him. He told my parents during appointment 3 that he thought I should start testosterone at 17. And, thankfully they were not on board with that. And, I still had a lot of problems. I wasn't very stable. And so, not having, the trans community will say it's awful they didn't affirm me, but, if they had, I could be infertile right now. I could have so many more health issues if I had started that young. But I ended up starting later on when I was in my late 20s. And at that point, I just called up Planned Parenthood to, I thought there'd be a process, which is what the trans community will also say often is like, you have to go through therapy or you have to live for a certain amount of time as your preferred gender. But I was prescribed testosterone after just 30 minutes. despite bringing up my comorbidities, I was just instantly affirmed and I got my prescription the same day. So things have changed a lot from when Joey went to her therapist and I had my experience with gender care.
That's shocking. I mean, where are the Joey therapists? They're gone. The person like, you're just an awesome, beautiful, butch lesbian. Live it, love it, sister. Welcome. They're gone because, and I want to bring in Stephanie for a minute here. Stephanie, thank you for being here. You're a therapist because the entire psychiatric community, the mantra, the commitment is affirm, period.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. As therapists, we've been sold a bill of lies, and we've essentially been convinced when it comes to gender not to do our jobs, not to explore the root causes of our patients' distress, not to favor our patients' long-term health and well-being, but instead to just agree with their self-diagnosis and enforce their delusions and lead them down a medical pathway instead of investigating psychological treatments for psychological conditions.
Is it true that this, quote, gender affirming care is the only care that is officially recommended by the American Association or Academy of Pediatrics?
Well, I don't know about the AAP, but it's certainly not true that that's the only form of treatment. I think Joey's story can attest to that. Traditionally, up until very recently, the approach that was used was one called watchful waiting, which simply means that if a young person is presenting with gender-related distress, no intervention is needed. Just give that person time to mature and develop, because as stories like Joey's will attest to, many of the people who grow up feeling like they're somehow different, they're gender atypical, grow up to be gay and lesbian. And they need time to figure that out. They need to struggle through their identity in adolescence, just as all of us struggle through matters of identity and belonging in adolescence, and eventually come to terms with their sexuality. There can also be many other reasons for gender-related distress, like the ones that Kat has talked about. And increasingly, as this has become so popular, we see that young people with almost any form of mental distress have learned, because of social influence, to attribute that distress to their gender when there could be many other causes. So watchful waiting is the traditional approach, and there are many approaches to therapy that can help people grapple with whatever is causing them distress. I believe in treating the root cause of the issue. Many of these young people have traits of borderline personality disorder due to complex trauma, for example, and so dialectical behavioral therapy would be the gold standard of care. There are many options besides so-called gender-affirming care.
And the deep problem about this is it's not like taking a Benadryl when you need a Tylenol. They set you down a path that's going to create so many more problems for you. Meantime, they haven't addressed the problem that really brought you into the therapist's office. So now you just have a Santa scroll-like list of issues that have not been addressed, that have been exacerbated. And Kat, that brings me back to you, because can we just spend a minute on the sexual assault and why that was a comorbidity that needed to be addressed, the trauma from that? But do you think that did lead you, was it related to your gender questioning?
At the time, it was very subconscious, but I think it really strengthened my gender dysphoria. I already suffered from gender dysphoria from when I was young for various reasons. But it happened when I was in high school. I was sexually assaulted, and I definitely think that exacerbated my distress and made me feel more urgent about wanting to medicalize and appear as a man. And that's at that point, I think was when I asked my parents to take me to the gender therapist. And of course, my parents thought it was just, oh, here's a specialist that will help her work through her issues and like help her accept herself. And that wasn't what happened at all.
Yeah, Abigail Schreier writes about that in Irreversible Damage, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, it saying how the parents need to be very careful before just taking your kid into a therapist on this. You got to find the right therapist, because otherwise you're just going to get affirm. You need to find a Stephanie who's open-minded to wherever this is going to go and understands that the vast, vast majority of kids who express any sort of dysphoric feelings are going to outgrow them. What are the percentages? I've heard so many different numbers on that, Stephanie, of the number of kids who will outgrow it.
Anywhere between 65 to 98%, depending on the study you look at. You have to consider the underlying factors. So back in Joey's day and age, when she was growing up, before the cultural environment was what it was for Cat when she was growing up, for example, of course, the percentages of gender dysphoria were lower in general, but they were primarily associated with kids who would grow up to be gay or lesbian. They were associated with gender nonconforming children. And so the studies show that the desistance rates are going to be higher depending on the psychosocial support. So a kid growing up in an environment that supports them coming to terms with their sexuality is ultimately more likely to grow their gender dysphoria than a kid growing up in a society with rigid gender roles that they can't relate to. Now that it's become a social contagion, I think the desistance rates, if the kids were simply left alone, would be much, much higher, because there are so many kids who wouldn't have had gender dysphoria a generation ago. The only reason they have any problem with their sexed body now is because of social influence. And it's really tragic that we're making this trend into a lifelong medical condition for these kids. I think the desistance rates, if kids were allowed to grow out of it at this day and age, would be very, very high.
And the other dynamic is once they start down the road of transition, it's very hard to stop, because the trans community will guilt you into staying with them. And they see you, Kat, I'm sure you know this firsthand, as a turncoat of sorts. It's very strange how it's like leaving a cult. You know how the first rule of leaving a cult is the cult has to turn on the escapee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that I won't say every trans identifying person, but, a lot of them do feel like detransitioners are a threat to them, because, the argument is that, of course, gender affirmation is the only treatment, and that just this very, at first it was no one detransitions, then it was a tiny, tiny percentage detransition. And, I don't think they'd be trying to hide the number of detransitioners if they didn't feel it was a threat to their ideology.
And that adds just another layer of stress, Joey, to these people like Kat, who have recognized they're not actually trans. They didn't need any of these treatments. And now they've got people turning on them. And again, as we discussed, all the underlying problems have gone unaddressed. New problems have been added. And now you got a group of very active bullies trying to shame you.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to address the issue that you brought up about the AAP, in that just this past October, Our Duty, which is a group here in the US now, we protested in front of the conference for the American Academy of Pediatrics. It is very much, the affirmation model is the only model that they are recommending. There's a doctor named Julia Mason. She co-authored a piece called Resolution 27, which basically was begging the AAP to pay attention and say, look what Sweden is doing. Look at what all these other countries are doing. Countries that were promoting this idea of a sex change, which we all know isn't real anyway. And they won't even listen to it. They didn't publish it. They would not promote it or anything. And so Resolution 27 is something that's popping up now and again as we are planning, more protests coming up in San Diego in May.
Joey, what are the countries that we just had on a guest who was telling us in the UK, they will not do these procedures on a minor. They won't even do the hormones on a minor. The United States, very different. I've heard Sweden mentioned a few times as a country that's like the UK and saying no. What are the countries that have said no to this?
I'd need help from Kat and Stephanie on this one. I don't know all the countries, but I know there are at least 6, I believe, at this point.
Sweden, Finland. Megyn, have you covered what happened at the Tavistock Kids Clinic yet?
Yep. Yes. Horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
France,
and now it's
Finland.
closed. Yeah. So why do you think, any thoughts from any of you on why are these countries over in Europe so far ahead of us on reaching sanity on this issue? What is it? Is it just wokeism is more ingrained here in America? The takeover of identity as the be all end all? Like why are we not willing to accept progress on these issues and realize we've made a mistake?
Well, for one thing, Megyn, all the countries that have reversed their policies have done, as far as I know, all of them have done systematic reviews of the evidence, which is exactly what, as Joey mentioned earlier, Dr. Julia Mason has called for and the AAP has suppressed.
What's the matter with the AAP, Joey? Go ahead. You go ahead, Kat, and then I'll bring in Joey. Go ahead.
Oh, quickly, I just wanted to say, I also think it has to do with the political polarization here. and the two-party system. Like, for instance, in the UK, there are more political parties with more nuanced views versus, like, for instance, people on the left here, a lot of them will support, children transitioning, for instance, because they're like, oh, well, it must be the right thing to do because I'm on the left, and the left supports gay rights and women's rights, etc. And they think anything that the conservatives are saying must be bad because it's so polarized here. And I don't think it's quite the same in countries like the UK. So people are able to look at things from a more complex perspective.
Interesting. And you're all of the left, are you not? Like, politically?
Disaffected. I've been red pilled.
Yeah, less
this
so
has
than
a
I
way of
used to
doing
be.
that.
I don't think after you've talked to politicians, like I've testified in front of the California Senate, for instance, and shared my story, and I was gaslit and told that couldn't have happened to me because trans people have to go through months or years of evaluation and therapy before getting hormones. And so they refused to believe my story. They were really rude to me. And I just realized they're not able to see reason. They're not objective. They have an agenda. And so I don't really trust either political party at this point.
Yeah.
I'm in the same boat as
smart.
Kat and Joey. I was always very liberal until a few years ago, and now I'm politically homeless. And I had a very similar experience to Kat. Of course, they weren't gaslighting me based on my personal experience, but I sat right next to my friend, detransitioner Camille Kiefel, who gave her testimony. And I watched these Democrat state representatives who seemed very confident that they were on the right side of history, just dismissing her experience. And when you've been through something like that, it leaves you feeling without a team.
Yeah, I know. It can get you voting for the 800-pound gorilla orange man bad. Like, that's really what it's like. Rick Grinnell came on the show and he said a line which has stayed with me. He's like, these people must be stopped. They can't even tell you what a woman is. It's like, well, I've never heard somebody boil down the argument for Republicans better than that. But
There's
Joey,
too much
what
money.
is it?
There's too much money. I can't say this enough. Jennifer Billick, who's in the film as well, she's an artist turned like accidental investigative journalist starting in 2013 in New York, where she was involved in the Green movement. And colleagues of hers had asked her, hey, we'd like to come to New York and do a talk. Can you find us a place to gather? Remember, this is 2013, New York City. She said, no problem. Great. She started to look at one venue that would say, yes, sure. And then all of a sudden get a phone call. Sorry, we can't give you the venue. No real reasons. Go to another venue. She fell through a few of those from what I understand. And then she thought, what is going on here? All of these normal conference rooms and things like that where you can rent space, we're turning them down. Why? Because the organization that she was trying to get a meeting space for believed in biological reality. And that is
right.
Some of the beginnings. We're talking 2013. Since then, Jennifer started, doing writings about this. She's got the 11th Hour blog. It is an undeniable breakdown of people like the Pritzker family, the money that was given to the Obama campaign, which, had I known then what I know now, I don't know if I would have been one of those Obama warriors, because I was really heavy into the Obama scene in the Bay Area, recruited a lot of people to vote for Obama. I had no idea that there were already things in place to be able to push the whole bathroom issue. Remember how that was such a big deal? It was like the bathrooms, and it started with that, and it just went from there. And Jennifer Pritzker, Martine Rothblatt. There are so many wealthy, mostly men. There are a number of women with huge investments in, guess what? Big pharma, medical appliances, Stryker Corporation. We're talking the tentacles of this it's so huge, but it's captured all of our media, and we've exported it. If you wonder why other countries haven't stopped, haven't backed off, this is what's going on. And unfortunately, and I don't know, Megyn, if you've studied much about the UN Agenda 2030, but everything that we're doing is falling right in line with the fact that it looks like we have maybe 6.5 years to maintain the humanity that we now know. And I know it might sound tin hat, but all people have to do is really read the UN Agenda 2030, which is supposed to be about sustainability all over the globe. Part of the sustainability is the removal of sex, the replacement with the word gender, so that it becomes this amorphous thing. And it's about population control and all kinds of stuff. But
Kelly J, I mean, that's one of Kelly J's issue is, you know, and I'll get to that with her the next time she comes on. She's like, I don't accept gender. Gender's not, it's a made up thing. Sex is what we should be talking about. Biological sex is what's real. And gender's a made up thing that's now being used to control the way we speak and so on. You agree with that, Joey?
Absolutely. I mean, it was a way in growing up again in the 50s and 60s. Gender is a social construct. It's something that the minute, you know, Jazz Jennings as a child, as a little boy who happened to do something or have some behavior that his mother decided was more girly, you know, what is that? That's gender. That's what we do when we have boys that are sensitive and they care about others the way that girls are conditioned to do. And if you have a girl that wants to play baseball, she might be a little roughhouse. All of a sudden, that's where gender came in. And that's all related to John Money.
Yes, the weirdo at Johns Hopkins who tried to split up those twin boys and raise one as a girl. But wait, this is so interesting to me because when I was at NBC, I did all these shows on gender dysphoria, kids, and so on. Shows for which I feel I need to atone. I really do. I just feel like I blindly jumped into be supportive and be kind and be compassionate, and even with kids, without stopping to realize what it was I was platforming and even advocating. I've really had my eyes open since then. But in any event, I used to be told on those shows by activists on the other side of this issue, gender is a social construct. It's nothing but a social construct. And I remember thinking, that's ridiculous. That's not true. Gender is real. You know, if you're a woman, you're a woman. If you're a man, you're a man. But I think I was conflating things, right? Like you're on the opposite side of this and you're saying the same thing, but for very different reasons. So can you just explain that, Joey, to people who are confused?
Well, the whole thing is, again, to use Jazz Jennings as an example of a poster boy for children becoming medicalized first socially, this idea that as a girl, for me, I was a really rough and tumble girl. And I used to look at bugs under microscopes and, you know, things like that. And everybody decided I was a tomboy. And so I got called a tomboy. So there's that whole thing of starting to move me socially towards this idea that I had to have boy in there somehow because I was doing things that were what I would say now is just natural exploration. And for a boy to grab a doll or to start having fantasy play where they're in a play or they're doing these things that we see somebody, I don't even want to say his name now, stealing every company that they can to advertise as a very, you know, as a girl. The whole thing of being a girl or being a boy, these are things that since I grew up in the 50s, and once I became a feminist and started looking at that was a much broader way for me to see how kids could be raised, which is let them have their natural exploration, let children gravitate towards things like playing with trains or playing with dolls or anything like that. But what we have now is all being dictated to children through a device, whether it's something they have in their hands or they are looking at, like a computer, like I'm looking at right now. The kinds of stuff that is coming across the screen and that children are getting access to is unbelievable. I mean, the idea of pornography and children getting exposed to pornography and they don't even know what it is through YouTube Kids, and then they get through YouTube Kids, they get interested in the influencers who are on their own YouTube channels.
Even Mr. Beast. We were just talking about that with Kelly J. Mr. Beast has got this guy who's transitioning in front. He's got 144 million subscribers. I heard Mr. Beast say at an event I attended not long ago, he wants to have 1 billion, which sounded like a great ideal. You know, go for it. You've been so successful. You spread joy. You do these fun videos. No, so quietly, he's one of the main stars of the show, is going from a biological man to dressing like a woman, hormone replacement therapy, showing off his long manicured nails, left his wife, saying his son has absolutely no problem with his 2-year-old. I'm sure the 2-year-old has absolutely no, sure. Okay. This is happening with a main character on one of the most popular YouTube shows. No, literally the most popular YouTube show that is out there. Can I just say, I've said this before, but I just want people to understand, even yours truly, when I was a little girl, grew up in the 70s, total tomboy. I was the only girl on the all boys baseball team. This is my favorite picture of myself, even now in my age. That's my favorite picture of myself right there. In the 70s, little girl, tomboy on a tire swing. Jeans, dirty, blue sweatshirt, boy haircut. I look like a boy. Joey, they would have been transitioning me too. Stephanie's brethren in the therapeutic field would have said, yeah, sure, all the signs are there. And as anybody can see, now I turned out to be a rather feminine woman, but certainly in some ways, I've always considered myself a little bit more male-like. I think I have more than my fair share of testosterone. It's probably why, I've done okay in my field and had some, weird public moments that people are aware of. But that's fine. I'm still in the tent. I'm still in the tent. And the problem is, Stephanie, they're not allowing for that now. And I don't even know if they're allowed to. So if you're a therapist now, and you say, let's explore whether you've had a sexual trauma or your parents are getting a divorce or you have an eating disorder or you're autistic, are you in trouble? Could you be violating a standard of care?
Well, I don't think you're actually violating any standard of care. I think that's a highly defensible move. However, most therapists have been intimidated out of doing that because of the bans on so-called conversion therapy. Now, conversion therapy used to mean these horrifically abusive practices. If you look at the Wikipedia page for conversion therapy, you will see a history of physically torturing people to try to decondition homosexuality. But now it's been redefined to this acronym, sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. So they've lumped sexual orientation and gender identity together, and they've used this very vague term, change efforts, to say that any therapist who is suspected of trying to change the gender identity of their patient is guilty of conversion therapy. So that puts a therapist in an ethical bind from the moment the client sets foot in our office or our virtual office, if you're like me and you work online, because we have to decide, what do I call my patient? What name and pronouns do I use for my patient? So if I don't work with this population anymore because I have a public presence, so I work with detransitioners and concerned parents instead. But if I were just an ordinary therapist without a public presence and I had a client coming to me saying that they wanted to be called the name and pronouns of the opposite sex, I would have a dilemma right from the beginning. Do I agree and collude with the client's current sense of self, or do I challenge that? This is a challenge we face right from the start. And the fear of every therapist is that if they show any skepticism toward the client's so-called identity, that the client could perceive them as trying to change their identity, even if the therapist is trying to help them get to the root cause of their gender dysphoria. The client could take offense to that and file a complaint. And so the system is really stacked against therapists. Most therapists have worked very hard to get our licenses, and our careers are really important to us. And so is doing right by people and frankly, being a little too agreeable some of the time. So that's why many therapists live in fear or go along with what's being asked, or simply avoid working with this population altogether, which is tragic because these young people really do need our help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're worried you're going to lose your license and your livelihood if you do your job the way you're supposed to do it. I can understand why a therapist wouldn't take the risk, but you're right. Then they should just get out of the business of helping these kids, because they can't. What they've been told effectively is, you can't help them. And as a parent, if my child ever expressed any of this dysphoria, et cetera, I would never take them to a therapist. I would do my homework and get them to somebody like you. But God, you have to work so hard. Most parents are working hard. They've got jobs. They've got their lives. They're not listening to these discussions. They don't know this stuff. They haven't read Irreversible Damage. So that's the problem. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about what happened to Cat when she got drawn into this whirlwind. And then I really do want to follow up on the autism thing, Stephanie, because I know it's like you have an autistic kid, you put them in this system, and before you know it, they're exiting being told they're trans, when that may not be it at all. And it's happening more and more. And I feel like to that population in particular, it's just so unfair. I mean, to all the populations who aren't, it is unfair. Stand by, more with the stars of the documentary Affirmation Generation. Again, you can get it at affirmationgenerationmovie.com. We'll be right back.
Clinicians, we've been sold a bill of lies. And I honestly feel for all my colleagues who are still doing the affirmation thing, who really think that they're doing the right thing. They really think they're on the right side of history. I understand that. That's going to come crashing down at some point, and it's going to be really hard to reckon with what they've done. Same with the teachers, doctors, and parents.
We're rushing to make a permanent medical transformation. I can't think of anything that I've seen in my time as a therapist that is more terrifying and destructive. I don't know what the long-term impact will be.
That's a clip from Affirmation Generation, The Lies of Transgender Medicine. Again, available to you at affirmationgenerationmovie.com. The executive producer of this movie, Joey Brite, is with us today, along with detransitioner Cat Cattinson and Stephanie Winn, who is a therapist whose soundbite you heard in part there. So let's first spend some time with Cat, because I want to hear, Cat, sort of how quickly you got therapized with hormones and so on. What age was it when you first had that first meeting where, you were basically affirmed?
Yeah, so it was age 17 when my gender dysphoria had increased in severity, and this was correlated with being sexually violated. And my parents took me to a gender therapist. He is the head honcho of gender care in Sacramento, which is the area I lived at the time. And he basically, so to back up a little bit, I'd had a history of severe eating disorders. So I had already previously been to an inpatient treatment center for that. And I was used to being really pressed on and questioned by therapists, and having everything that came out of my mouth be questioned. And that was the exact opposite of what he did. And so when I just said, well, I really hate being a girl. I feel like I should be a boy. I want to be a boy. And he just said, okay, man. And he started calling me he, him. And it was like immediate affirmation. And, there was a part of me that was happy about that. But then there was a part of me that was also well, this is kind of odd. And by appointment 3, he asked both my parents to come into his office, and he told them, I think that he should start testosterone. That'd be my professional recommendation. And my parents were shocked. They thought he was going to be working with me on psychological issues. And so they didn't take me back to see him again.
So how long? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, part of me was honestly a little bit relieved, just because it felt too fast even to me. And I had some other things I was dealing with. I always wondered what would happen to my singing voice. And that was also this huge passion of mine. And actually a fundamental goal was to be a singer. So anyway, it was crazy though, how fast the process went.
How long after that did you begin testosterone?
So it was a long process for me. It was 2008 when I saw that therapist at age 17. So I was still ahead of the current wave of people who are transitioning and detransitioning. But after my bad experience, so when I was 23, so 4 years later, and at this point was when I was living on my own independently, I did pursue going on testosterone again. I was prescribed a mega dose of injectable testosterone, intramuscular. And I was not given any instructions on how to do it. I mean, I was sent home with a packet on how to do it, but no one injected it for me or showed me how to do it. And so I injected this mega dose of testosterone. It was really scary and traumatic. I was worried I would hit a vein and that I could die or something, which actually is possible if you're injecting intramuscularly. And that was when I was 23. And then after injecting, I had all of these aggression, I had emotional instability. I got hot flashes. I just it just really scared me. And I was like, you know what? I still think that I'm trans, but I'm just not going to medicalize. Like, this seems like a nightmare. But then I went back to my university in California, and the ideology there was like, another thing I'd been worried about is that I wouldn't pass as a man, because I'm only 5'2" and I'm like very petite and like very feminine looking. And my family had told me like, you can't you're not going to pass as a man. But then when I got to my university in California, like people were like, oh, trans is beautiful, you know, like don't worry about it if you can't pass, like you're going to find your authentic self. Like, and then I started thinking, well, maybe I could be happy if I transitioned. And then finally I had a really traumatic breakup of like a long relationship, and that kind of I think triggered me to be like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to medicalize, or I'm going to start taking testosterone. And so I came out as trans in 2019 publicly. And then in 2020 was when I finally I went full steam ahead with my medical transition and started injecting testosterone.
You mentioned the voice. The documentary spends some time on that. Your voice did change. We've cut a couple of clips from the piece so we can talk about it. Here is your voice before the testosterone in clip 11. My God, it's amazing. Incredibly beautiful. Everything about that is beautiful. And then this is 2.5 months into testosterone.
I have often dreamed of a far-off place where a great warm welcome would be waiting for me, where the crowds will cheer when they see my face, and a voice keeps saying, this is where I'm meant to be.
Cat, can I tell you, that makes me so sad. That makes me so sad. You look beautiful. You look like a man. And your voice sounds so much lower, but it makes me sad to see that, because I feel like that was done to you and not by you.
Yeah. You know, I really, I do wish that, like, because I actually asked the doctor, you know, at Planned Parenthood, like I said, you know, I am a semi-professional singer. It's also just very therapeutic for me and a big part of my life. And, you know, what can I do with the testosterone? Like, can I start at a lower dose? Like, you know, what can I do to preserve my voice? And basically what I was told is that my voice would get deeper, but I wasn't told about all of the issues that I'd have with my voice. And like, I've been dealing with persistent pain since starting testosterone, basically. And, you know, I've been getting some tests done to actually see what that is. But yeah, I definitely don't feel like I was prepared for the changes that happen. And people always like, you know, I've been really jumped on by trans activists and been told I was stupid for like not expecting the voice changes, but like no one told me I would be in pain, or the extent of like how difficult it would be to sing. And, you know, thankfully I've been retraining my voice for 2 years, and I actually really love my voice again now. Like I have
we have a clip of that too. We have a clip of that too. Here's
cool.
Your current voice. Let's take a listen.
Before the day I met you, life was so unkind, but you're the key to my peace of mind. 'Cause you make me feel, you make me feel, you make me feel like a natural woman.
Good choice. Good choice of songs. Do you expect it to return to the way it once was? I mean, entirely, or no?
No, I at this point, I don't think it's ever going to be exactly the same as it was, but I've actually regained quite a bit of the upper range as well. Like later in that song, I actually jump up an octave to like the closer to the original key. But it's the tone quality is like very different, and it feels very different. And then also when I'm trying to sing for long periods of time, my voice gets more fatigued, and it's harder to bring it up higher, because basically what happens when you take testosterone is you end up with thicker vocal folds. They're like thicker and heavier, but your diaphragm and your lung size, your lung capacity and all of that stays the same. So it's actually harder to create enough air pressure to bring that voice higher. And there's some other anatomical issues that can happen as well. And, I really am fortunate that I stopped testosterone after only a few months, because I think if I would have kept going, I probably would have lost that upper register, like for good.
Yeah.
And it was gone for quite a while to begin with. And I didn't know if it would come back. And I'm very thankful that it has.
Oh, thank God. It would have gone a different way had you been listening to those around you. We spend a second, Stephanie, in our final moments on autism and, frankly, eating disorders? I'm not a therapist, but we mentioned Dylan Mulvaney. I think Dylan Mulvaney's clearly got an eating disorder. I mean, the person has absolutely no weight on them. And I feel like I'm not surprised to hear Cat saying she was struggling with one too. It's like everything gets channeled into gender now, even something as serious as autism, which should not be confused with gender. But what's the connection there and what's happening there?
Well, it really makes sense if you think about the experience of the typical autistic child. And let's take an autistic girl, for example. Autistic girls have an especially difficult time when adolescence hits because female social behavior, let's admit it, is confusing. It's complicated and subtle and self-contradictory, especially if you think about middle school and high school girls. And so if you're an autistic girl, especially undiagnosed, you're not able to track what's happening socially. You're not picking up on those cues. And then you become bullied and excluded. You don't understand all the social messages going by, but you don't fit in. You can't keep up with these female ways of relating. You probably also have sensory issues. So things like dressing in a stereotypically feminine fashion or spending lots of time on uncomfortable beauty procedures just doesn't make any sense or feel good. And so then you're coping with a lot of anxiety and shame because things aren't going well for you, but you don't understand why. Then this ideology steps in and it says, here's why you don't feel like a girl. It's because you're not one. You were born in the wrong body. You were really meant to be a boy. And that is just so seductive because it offers relief from all of that stress and shame that they've been carrying. And it offers a concrete path forward with steps that they can understand. Going to the therapist, getting a letter, getting puberty blockers, binders, injections, and so on. It's a path that they understand, and that's very appealing to these autistic girls.
Oh my God, I was always thinking it was the parents who are like, oh yes, let's do gender dysphoria. That's a better diagnosis than autism. You raise a much more complicated and pernicious problem, which is they're tapping into the insecurities of the person who may be on the spectrum in an appealing way. This is sick. You can learn much, much more thanks to these amazing women at AffirmationGenerationMovie.com, an important film, a brave film, as are its makers and participants. Thank you all so much for sharing and speaking out. All the best to you. Wow.
Thanks, Megyn.
Thanks to our audience for yes, anytime. And thank you to our audience for sharing the journey with us this week. It's been a big one, right? We've been talking about this issue a lot because it's important, and I appreciate you doing it with me. Have a great weekend. We will be back on Monday. In the meantime, check out the American News Minute. Go to MegynKelly.com and you can celebrate Strudwick's birthday and see what mischief he caused on it. It's sort of an evolution. You'll see. Naughty as ever.